Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Let's try it one more time. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't here alone. My name's Cassandra Walker-Pye, and on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Public Policy Institute of California, I am pleased to welcome all of you to this event in our 2023 Speaker Series on California's Future. And this one is titled Funding Education in California. We are delighted to present this program today featuring Tony Thurmond, California Superintendent of Public Instruction. Sure, you're welcome to applaud. Assemblymember Josh Hoover. There he is. And Mr. Ben Chida, who's the Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary of the Office of Governor Gavin Newsom. Welcome to all three of you. And then moderating today's conversation, and again, this says new, but I'm going to say veteran, is PPIC's veteran, President and CEO Tani Cantil-Sakauye. She's been in the job for 6 months. She's old. She's got it down. But as all of you know, for 12 years prior to joining PPIC, Tani served as Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. We are so blessed to have her. So thank you all for joining us today. Before we start, I'd like to also thank the sponsors of our speaker series. Their support makes it possible for these events to be free and available to the public. The sponsors are listed on the screens in front of you and on our website. The series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, a groups of individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. So please visit our website to find information on how you might join as a sponsor or donor if you're interested. And then before we begin, just one or two housekeeping items to mention. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. At the end of today's program, there will be time to respond to audience questions. For those of you here in Sacramento in the room, raise your hand. PPIC staff will come to you with a microphone. Please state your name and your organization before asking your question. And then for those of you who are joining us virtually, and we are happy to have you do so, please send an email to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Be sure to also include your name and organization along with your question. Our staff will be monitoring the questions that come in and incorporating them into the program as much as possible. Lastly, and most importantly, and you know who you are, please silence your cell phones. Now, on to the program. And before the panel begins, I'm really happy to be able to turn this over to Julien Lafortune, a PPIC research fellow who's going to give us a brief presentation on the local control funding formula. Julien, come on up. Thank you all.
All right, thanks everyone, and thanks again to our sponsors. I just wanted to begin today by providing a little bit of background information on how schools are funded in California and what the local control funding formula is that we're talking about. And so I think it's useful to begin, before even talking about the formula, to just understand where school funding comes from in California. And there are three primary sources. There's state dollars, there's local dollars, and there's federal dollars. And state dollars comprise about 55 to 60% or so in a given year. It fluctuates depending on the year, and that's primarily through general fund dollars, but sometimes through other supplemental dollars like the state lottery, for example. Local dollars are primarily raised through local property taxes. There are other funds as well, and that's about a third of funding depending on the year. And then the smallest share is federal funding, and that's often allocated towards specific programs like Title I for low-income students in schools, or the federal school meals program. And that's typically less than 10%, maybe somewhere from 6 to 9% of school funding, although it's higher. It was higher in the Great Recession due to stimulus funding, and it's been higher since the pandemic due to a large influx of stimulus funding. So it makes up a higher share, in recessions or periods otherwise of economic and financial distress. And so that's how schools are funded. Now, what about the funding formula? So 10 years ago, the state fundamentally shifted its system of school finance, and it shifted to a funding formula called the Local Control Funding Formula, or LCFF. And LCFF was really about two things primarily. First, it's about increasing funding for high-need students, and under the formula, high-need students are defined as those who are low income, who are English learner, or foster youth. And the way that it does this is through what the kind of wonky term is a weighted funding formula. And that basically means that districts get more dollars when they have more high-need students. And I'll show you a little bit more about what this looks like on the next slide. And then second, LCFF was also about simplifying the funding formula. And so it gave districts a lot of extra flexibility. There was less reliance on restricted and categorical funding than there was a decade ago. And that really gives districts a lot more autonomy on how to spend these dollars rather than, say, have it dictated by policymakers at the state level. And just for context, where have spending levels gone over the past decade? So prior to LCFF, when we count total spending, so this includes both funding formulas, revenues, but also spending that comes from federal and other sources, it was about $14,000 per student in 2012-13, and most recently it's close to $23,000 per student. So it's gone up significantly. Some of the recent increase is due to federal stimulus funds that will soon expire, but the point is that we're basically now in a position where the state at least has more kind of financial capacity for its schools and school funding than it did a decade ago, at the kind of emerging from the depths of the Great Recession. And so a bit more on the funding formula itself. And so how does this weighted formula target student need? Well, each school district gets a base grant that's about $10,000 per student every year, and that depends a little bit about on the grade level, but we'll just call it, for purposes of today, about $10,000. And then for each additional high-need student, that student kind of generates under the formula 20% more, and that's called the supplemental grant. And you kind of see that here on the graph, in the next line up from the base grant. And that means districts with more high-need students get more funding under the supplemental grant. And then above the 55% cutoff, so if you're in a district that has 55% or more high-need students, you get even more funding, and that's called the concentration grant. And then that actually was increased last year in 21-22, so now there's even greater concentration grant funding than there was. And so what does that mean? If you're a district with essentially no high-need students, you get the base grant, about $10,000 per student. If you're a district that has almost all high-need students, you get about 50% more, about $15,000 per student. So that's a lot of additional resources to target towards students in these high-need categories. So then what do we know about the impacts of the formula, at least so far in its first decade? And there's a few things that I'll point out. And first is that when we look specifically at these dollars targeted for high-need students, we find that especially the concentration grant funding has led to improved student outcomes, higher test scores, higher graduation rates, higher rates of college course readiness. And that is something that comes from research that we've done at PPIC as well as others at UC Berkeley and other institutions. But the second thing is also that not all of these additional funds for high-need students are necessarily reaching the high-need students in schools in the proportion that the formula would dictate. And so, why does that matter? We're targeting funding to districts, but it matters how they then distribute that funding across their schools and their students and their programs. And this kind of relates to some of the more, long-standing achievement concerns, both in terms of the level of performance, as well as achievement gaps that have, predated LCFF and actually become exacerbated during the pandemic. So I'll leave us with this. Okay, well, what do we want to know then, looking forward into the next decade of LCFF about the state's funding formula? And as I mentioned, these concerns around targeting are fundamentally about this balance between autonomy at the district level and accountability from the state level. And so what is the right balance there? Should the state provide more of a sense of how these funds should be targeted or not? Or should districts have kind of the autonomy and the flexibility to distribute them as they see fit? I think that's an ongoing both kind of policy concern as well as a political one. And then thinking more generally about the challenges that we face, does the formula need some sort of retuning, for example? Is the base level sufficient? Is the amount of funding that we give to high-need school sites rather than districts sufficient? Are there different weights we should put on different students, or should we define high need differently than we do today? I think these are all conversations that have been happening, that have been considered. And they relate to some of the most ongoing, pressing ongoing challenges we have around learning recovery from the pandemic, around declining enrollment, and around shortages in critical staff and educators at our school. And so, how we best kind of deploy these resources that we have, these state scarce resources, is really, kind of a key question, and kind of mediates the efficacy and the kind of equity under the formula for how we can address, the challenges that are facing us today. So with that, I'm excited to kind of kick us off towards the panel. So I'll pass it over to our PPIC President and CEO, Tani Cantil-Sakauye, to lead us off in this discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cassandra, for the warm welcome. Thank you, Julien, for that very helpful primer that sets the table for us to discuss the success of our 6 million students K through 12. And as you can see from Julien's presentation, that's part of the excellence of PPIC. Thank you again, Julien and Cassandra. PPIC welcomes this very distinguished panel to talk about this critical subject, and their biographies are on the table, but also on our PPIC website. And so I'll be very brief in describing their many honors here today, starting with the California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond. He was elected to this office in January 2019. Prior to that, Superintendent Thurmond served in the Assembly, and also prior to that, relevant to this particular conversation, he was a board member on the Contra Costa Unified School District. Thank you for being here. Thank you. We also welcome Assemblymember Josh Hoover, elected in November 2022 to the Assembly. The Assemblymember prior to this was a board member of a school district, the Folsom Cordova Unified School District in the greater Sacramento area. Thank you for being here, Assemblymember. We also welcome Mr. Ben Chida, who is a senior policy advisor for Governor Gavin Newsom for cradle to career issues. Mr. Chida is a lawyer. He has previously advised our Vice President, Kamala Harris, and also he was a third grade school teacher in New York City. Welcome, thank you for being here. This first question is to all of you to be answered, but we're going to start with Superintendent Thurmond and then to you, Mr. Hoover and Mr. Chida, and that is, how well would you say that the local school funding formula has lived up to its original intention and purpose? Superintendent.
Thank you, Your Honor. And thank you for the 10 years of the series that you led on keeping kids out of prison and in schools. Thank you. And we're excited to work with you in this new capacity. Good afternoon. To put it in context, I served on a school board in 2008, and the first night that I was being sworn in, I was asked to vote to close 10 schools. I cussed a lot of bad words that night. And I said, that's not why I came here. And they said, we know this is a bad choice for kids, but we're asking you to do it because you have to, because of the Great Recession. And so as someone who admittedly liked categorical programs, I'm grateful that we have the local control funding formula because it created a stabilization for our state. It has allowed us to essentially move from being at the bottom of per pupil spending in all states to being around 20th. We probably allocated about $81 billion in the budget year that we are in, with some incredible programs to support students in every way. What I love about it is that it moved us from the bottom to being in the top 20, and that it created a framework to allow family members to be part of the decision making about how these dollars get spent. The LCAP process is a great way to engage our interest holders, our students, our families, in making decisions about how the money gets spent. Is it a perfect system? No. It certainly, though, has moved us in a great direction, and I think we have a lot more work to do to get our students to be our state to fund schools in a way where we can be number one, because our kids are number one. And what I learned as a legislator is that you show your values by what you put in your budget. And so when we can get things to be number one, and I know that we don't endorse ballot measures in this audience, but I think that we can move a ballot measure that will close loopholes in Prop 13 and get us the kind of revenue that we need to help close the gap for our students. Until then, I'm grateful that last year, with the help of our governor and our legislature, we put 13% more into local control funding formula for our districts. And you will hear today the kinds of programs that we have for expanded learning, $4 billion, learning recovery block grant, $8 billion. All of those funding streams build off of the LCFF framework and how we give a percentage to our students. And so it has, I'm grateful to people like Governor Jerry Brown and Mr. Mike Hurst and all the State Board of Education members who helped to create it. I'm grateful to Governor Newsom, who has added to it, and our legislative partners. But until we get to the place where we fund education as number one, and we create buckets of dollars for pre-K through higher education to support our institutions of higher education, we can't rest on our laurels. We have work to do, but thank goodness that we've moved from asking people to close schools to having a system like LCFF to provide adequate funding for our schools, to give them local decision making, and to prioritize low-income students and foster youth and English learners. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation and grateful that we start with a strong base of funding for our schools.
Thank you, Superintendent, for that answer. And also thank you for bringing up the LCAPs, the accountability program, and also the engagement of the parents as well and the community in this important mission for success for our students. Same question to you, Mr. Hoover.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. In regards to the question, I think the local control funding formula was a really important shift in education funding policy in California. I'll be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of categoricals. I think that the best decisions in education are made at the local level. And what the local control funding formula allowed was for local governments and local school boards to have more control over what priorities that they wanted in their communities. And so from that perspective, I think LCFF was a really critical shift in California. I think, though, as the superintendent mentioned, I think there is still work to be done. I do think that it has helped us raise raise our funding in California, our per pupil spending in California. But I come from a school district that it includes two cities, two very different needs. I have a higher income city and a lower income city in the school district that I represented prior to being in the assembly. And I think there are some serious tweaks that need to be considered when it comes to concentration grant dollars, as was discussed in the slide presentation. It's interesting, we have, in that district in particular, we have a situation where you have a lot of very high need students in one community, but because of the students with fewer needs in the other community, it actually brings down that percentage, and it is one of the only districts in Sacramento County that does not qualify for concentration grant dollars. And so I think we need to look at potentially expanding those dollars to a site-based system where we're actually looking at the needs of each individual school rather than each individual district to help provide more funding to those students that really need it. And so I look forward to working with my partners in the legislature on that as we continue to move forward, and also have had some great conversations with the superintendent about that as well.
Thank you, Assemblymember Hoover. It's so significant that you had that experience of representing a district at one time before you were an assembly member, but still in your area, that has a school of relatively fairer wealth than the other, and that you feel different effects as a result of LCFF. So you see, boots on the ground, as we've said, the need for some changes to ensure that every student gets the attention and opportunity for success that was the intent of LCFF. So thank you for that. Same question to you, Mr. Chida, from the governor's office.
Yeah, so first I would say I 100% sign on to both of what you said. And I think in some ways, it's not a trade-off between sort of categoricals or not. I think in a lot of ways, LCFF was a necessary reset. I think what happened was systems tend to drift from their mission over time. They tend, as programs sort of aggregate and you have rules and regulations that accumulate and you have structures that calcify, it becomes harder and harder to do things, let alone innovate. It's very stifling, and we've known that. I was talking to a lot of you in the audience earlier, and I know a lot of you are public servants, and we've all been in that spot, right, where we're working with a system or within a system, and we're not really sure why the outcome or why the decisions are being made the way that they are. In a lot of ways, people become focused in on compliance, on box checking, on just making sure that the system kind of sustains itself and perpetuates itself in a lot of ways. So I think in a lot of ways, the LCFF was a necessary reset. What I love about it was it recognized the truth that was hidden in plain sight, which is that our public schools are about people. It's about people coming together, parents, families, students, co-creating plans together with education professionals, teachers, administrators, everybody, and actually having those plans powered by a fair and equitable funding system. That is the overall vision, and that is the right basis for us to work off of. So I think in a lot of ways, you know, the sort of promise of LCFF hasn't been, in the vision, hasn't been fully realized, and we have a great deal of work left to do. But I'm so, so grateful for the work that's been done so far, because it's set the foundation, a sound foundation for us to work off of, one that is centered on the lived reality of what's happening in our schools and what our families and our parents and our students want.
Thank you, Mr. Chida. I fully agree with what you say in resetting and centering and remembering the purpose of why this work is being done for California, for the students, for our future. I think that's, and your perspective, particularly with cradle to career issues, makes this all the more pressing and relevant. I thought I'd ask you before I move into additional questions. We've heard a lot about LCFF and about what it means and what its intent was, some concerns, but I ask you just very briefly say, each of you, in your own words, what you think has been the single most greatest success of LCFF before we move on to other questions. And I'll start with you, Assemblymember Hoover.
Yeah, I think no doubt it has been empowering local school districts to do what's best for their students. Increasing local control, I think to the extent that we can do that in education, I think the state needs to be very careful to stop passing unfunded mandates along to school districts and to allow local school districts to actually govern themselves. And so I think that is a really critical, that's probably the biggest benefit of LCFF. I would like to see local school districts do even more to innovate at the local level. I think that it's been a decade or so, and we haven't seen maybe the level of innovation that we had hoped to see in these different, laboratories of education. But I do think it's important that we preserve that local control.
Thank you. Mr. Chida.
Yeah.
What do you say?
I would basically agree. I think that in a lot of ways what was most successful or what's most innovative is giving parents and families a seat at the decision-making table. This isn't a situation in which we're, talking about parents and their empowerment through the lens of giving them the right to sue or giving them the right to make decisions about, particular small things that are happening in the school around school libraries or, what's happening sort of day to day or what teachers say. It has more to do with how can we actually give parents a seat at the decision-making table when it comes to budgets, when it comes to programs, when it comes to priorities. And I do think that's a pretty revolutionary and positive step forward.
Thank you. Superintendent.
I think that the most special feature about the LCFF is building in that for every allocation, we must support the needs of our disadvantaged students. It shouldn't matter what your zip code is or the neighborhood that you grow up in. Every student deserves to have access to a great quality education, and LCFF builds that right into the system. We live in a state that has, like most states, dealt with inequity in education probably since the start of public education. If you lived in a neighborhood where your parents could give a little bit more for the extras, you got the art teacher and the music teacher and the computer teacher, and teachers got paid better salaries. LCFF creates a great equalization opportunity to say that because of supplemental grants and concentration grants, that now built into the framework and built into the formula are considerations. How we offset poverty, how we offset the fact that we have 200,000 homeless students in our state, that we have hungry students in our state, that we have students who are newcomers and struggling just to get basic needs met. I appreciate that as one of the powerful features that is built into LCFF, and it has affected the conversation of almost every other funding stream that has come down from the state since. I came to Sacramento as an assembly member because I figured if all the cuts are going to be passed down, I'm going to go to the place where they're making those decisions. I don't think we've had a lot of unfunded mandates since LCFF, and certainly not in these last several years, but we do need a permanent funding source to address the needs of K-12 education. We cannot expect that the level of budget funds that we've seen in the last few years are going to continue. We know that they won't. This is the first year that we've seen less revenue, and we have to be prepared that there may be more. And so even with these considerations for equity, I think we have to really set our sights on creating permanent and stable funding sources for pre-K through 12th grade and for higher education in our state.
Thank you. So I'm hearing from all of you greater local control that includes parents and teachers on serious issues. And I'm also hearing equity, and that equity is also setting an example for other funding streams, which also then establishes and proves the need for sustainable funding for that equitable flow for all students. So I hear it on interesting and impeccable source that 10 years ago, before this was passed and as it was being discussed, the first caucus to support LCFF was the Senate Republican Caucus for greater local control. I was informed that the last caucus to support LCFF was the Assembly Democratic Caucus because of a lot of issues that pertain to the details of what LCFF would do. So asking both you, Superintendent, and you, Assemblymember Hoover, you Assemblymember Hoover's talked about involving, and Mr. Chida, more parents, more decision making. How does that really look? What happens at the school district? And both of you have school district experience. What does that look like for the rest of us who haven't been at those tables? What's the experience of LCFF?
Still holding on to what you said about which parties were first to sign on and which party was last. I wasn't here, for starters. The first thing that came to my mind is the original Republican Party of Lincoln was the party that freed the slaves. Sometimes things change with parties, and so even if the Democrats were late to get on board, it's just a fact. Things do change, and I don't know what the conversations were of the parties at that time about it, but I think that people do all agree that giving districts as much money as you can and as much flexibility as you can is critical. I will say that I've seen some districts be very sophisticated in how they have engaged family members and students in the conversation about LCAP planning, but there are many places where this work can be better. Oftentimes what is discussed is complicated, and the documents that are provided to families, big, thick documents, we have to be mindful of our audiences, our families and students. They have jobs, they have lives, they have school. We have to make it as possible for them to be engaged. And this year I've appointed the first ever statewide student advisory council to advise the Department of Education and for the legislature and the governor, as well as a parent advisory council. And so, we're in a battle right now where people are asserting local control and parent rights, for example. And I believe in both of those things. But I do not think that either of those things extends to the right to ban a book or to discriminate against LGBTQ plus students or students of color. And there comes a time when we have to say that local control is important, but there comes a time when we have to step in to protect the rights of our students. And that's why we have a bill this year that says if you ban a book, you actually will lose funding in the LCFF funding formula. And Mr. Chida and the governor have worked with us on this bill in places where there's been discrimination against our students. I'm very encouraged that we have a framework for how parents get engaged in the LCAP process, but I don't see it by and large that everywhere our parents and students are pulled into that process to be a part of that process. And I would say if there's homework for us, this is a place where we still have work to do to maximize the level of engagement and participation of parents and families, students, and other interest holders in how those decisions get made about how dollars get spent.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very good answer for us in terms of what this looks like, what the school districts and the boards are grappling with in terms of engagement. Assemblymember Hoover?
Well, I will just say that, I think one of my biggest frustrations when I was on a school board, even with LCFF in place, was the level of state direction and state involvement in education policy in California. And this came from my colleagues on the left and the right that were on the board. They wanted to govern their school district the way they saw fit. And the reality is that legislators like to pass bills. And legislators like to do things on education, right? And
that is true.
We don't love, we, meaning the legislature, doesn't love the idea of allowing locals to govern, because then we get to do less, right? But the reality is that we probably need to do less, and that we elect local school board members for a reason. We elect local, in fact, they are elected by their local voters and their local communities and their local families, right? And so we really do need to empower them to make decisions as it relates to education. And so I think that that would be something that was shared across the board by my colleagues on all sides of the aisle when I was on the school board, which is that why does the state keep telling us what to do in these different areas? Why is the state passing new graduation requirements? Why aren't they allowing local school districts to make those decisions? And I think as a legislature, we need to be willing to take a step back, allow the local control funding formula to fund school districts and empower local districts and local families, but also take a step back on policy and allow them to govern themselves when it comes to what educational programs that they offer.
Thank you. Like all important issues, it's a balancing act, and the more voices, the more balancing. So I appreciate both of your thoughtful answers. So, Mr. Chida, this question is for you in terms of, we've heard that LCFF has made funding more equitable. We know that we need more sustainable funding for that. We also know that tweaks could be made as described here already. Tell us about the governor's multiplier, his equity multiplier.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways it speaks to the ways in which LCFF gives us a good structure to work off of when we're trying to solve for equity in the big picture. So not individual programs and try to figure out what is the specific policy that's going to lead to more equity, but rather how do we strategically achieve equity. And so the equity multiplier was a priority for us because we wanted to make sure that there was additional funding going into concentration grants. So it actually added, in the prior budget, we did $1.1 billion with the legislature for ongoing funds for concentration grant for schools to hire additional staff, and then we did another $300 million with the equity multiplier for especially vulnerable students. I think actually the interesting thing about what we were doing with the equity multiplier that was basically ignored by almost everybody is the broader accountability measures that we put into place. So in addition to the $300 million with the equity multiplier, I think the more impactful change that we worked with the legislature to drive through last budget was holding school districts or LEAs accountable for schools that are persistently underperforming. So if you are a school that has, at the school site level, if you are at the lowest indicator on the dashboard, then you need to incorporate into your LCAP a plan and specific investments that you plan on making that will actually address that underperformance. And then you need to evaluate it over years. And so what that really does is it leverages all $80+ billion of LCFF and drives it towards closing achievement gaps. It actually systematizes a process by which our districts are going to be held accountable for having schools close achievement gaps on a year-over-year basis. So I think that's actually the more interesting thing that we did last cycle. But of course, $300 million for the equity multiplier will hopefully help to power some of those solutions as well.
I think that's very important for all of us to know, such that the issues are being addressed and they are going to be continued to be addressed until and unless it drops off the agenda because it's been resolved. And both the superintendent and I think all of you have mentioned LCAPs, and so let's turn our attention to talk a little bit about the local control accountability programs. That's an important component of delivering on this promise and the $80 billion as you've described for our schools. So how well has the process worked so far? It's a question for all of you, but I'll start with you, Mr. Hoover.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's an important one that we need to ask. If there is an area where I think tweaks need to be made, I would say the LCAP is probably one of them. I would say, as someone who was pretty integrally involved in the LCAP process, I don't, it's a great sounding acronym. I'm not sure that it has been great in practice, and I say that from, I love accountability. I think accountability is critical, but I think it is very inaccessible and complex for parents and families, and even teachers to a degree, to deal with and to be a part of that process. And so I think, the LCAP has, in my mind, turned into this box that you check as a school district, where we did our local accountability plan. I don't think it has in practice been a very valuable tool for parental engagement, for accountability. And so I would love to see some steps made, and I think this could be a bipartisan effort to make it more accessible, to simplify the process, and to really just make it something that is really more meaningful than just a box that you check at the end of every year.
Thank you for that candid answer. Superintendent?
Yeah, I think the Assembly member is right. There has to be a way to make the process very accessible. I think regardless of where you live in the state, regardless of your political orientation or your views, everyone wants to see their student do well. They want their schools to do well. Let's just face it, school budgets are complicated in every facet: the language, the format, the volume, and the length of the presentation. The places where I've seen it done very well to engage families in the LCAP process have facilitators who are what I would call family engagement equipped. They know how to engage folks, break it down into everyday language, drop the acronyms, or at least define what the acronyms stand for so that people know where the money is going. I've seen facilitators, intermediaries, community-based organizations that partner with school districts do the pre-work to help to get families ready for the discussions about the LCAP. How many times have you gone to a meeting where you sat down and someone put something in front of you and said, okay, vote for your top 10 priorities, and you haven't even had a chance to do any homework to really give it some thought? When I've seen these intermediaries really work with community groups, they do outreach to get people to come and to attend. A lot of folks don't know that our schools have a school site council and other structures that can engage someone who has a concern, everything from programming to sports to the curriculum that's going to be used at a school. But you can't just expect people to just drop in and know that all these things are available and then, okay, now we want you to vote on what goes into LCAP. And so to me, this is an opportunity for family engagement at its best, that we do some pre-work, we do outreach with families, we let them know that there's something called an LCAP, what it is. Here's an opportunity for you to imprint on the choices that are going to be made about how the dollars in your school, in your district, get spent, and provide them support to be ready to engage in those meetings. I've seen that done in Oakland Unified, really great facilitation from a group called OCO that did great work. I've even seen it done through the Alameda County Office of Education, where they brought students who were in alternative schools, students who were in a juvenile camp, who had time to study the proposals around the county's budget, and come and make a presentation to the Board of Education on what should go into LCAP. We can make this an accessible process, and it's in our best interest to do that, to listen to our constituents and let them feel fully empowered and engaged, and to act on the choices that they make to their school districts.
Thank you. You know, such very thoughtful in the sense too, right? That we're talking about K through 12 in public school. So the sooner that a parent can get involved in the development and the programming of its student in the school, or understand it and know it has a voice, will make a big difference over the arc of that education. And then, of course, that feeds into all the issues with and help with higher education. Same question to you, Mr. Chida.
Yeah, 3 notes. I think the first is just, this isn't unique to education or the LCAP. I think that in a lot of ways, trying to, make sure that we are engaging locally with communities, like think of a city council meeting, think of any sort of local context. It frequently is the case that we are working with people who are working all the time, they're working people. It's like they're busy. Mm-hmm. They don't have time. They really can't be deluged with this avalanche of paperwork and then be expected to, like you're both saying, just, be ready to make an informed decision. It's got to be more than a rubber stamp. So I think that's certainly just one brief note. The second is, I think in a lot of ways what parents and families want is not to have they actually don't want to be engaged and micromanage every decision happening at the school. But they do want to have a say in the key decisions being made. Budget decisions, programmatic decisions, key priority decisions. So I think that's why the LCAP is actually a sound structure for us to work off of, because it doesn't give the full scope of like, hey parents, like you're going to decide everything that's happening in the school. It's more like we're going to invite you to give you a seat at the decision-making table for the key, most important decisions that are going to drive what happens in the school long term. And the last thing, I completely agree, this is bipartisan. As part of the equity multiplier trailer bill language that I talked about, we also made additional tweaks that had to do with trying to simplify the information that was being given to parents and families. Again, not enough. And then we also still have from 2 budgets ago, the $100 million in the community engagement initiative, which is also an effort to try to get more parent engagement, actually pull parents in, inform them earlier, give them actual space to think about and make informed decisions. So I completely agree with both of what they said.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I'm being advised that we're to move to the Q&A portion, and I suspect this is a pretty wonky group of folks, so I will take my questions and park them at the time being, but this is the time in the audience that we ask you to raise your hand and state who you are, what organization that you may represent, and to ask a question of our panelists. So we can begin. We have some PPIC runners with microphones who will come to you here. And Sal, this gentleman has his hand up. And so please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. And so Yancy, we have here at the front also. So we'll start as you approach, Yancy, to this table here. Please, sir.
Mark Epstein, California Environmental Technology Education Network. One of the big concerns that I've had, and we saw it with the distance learning and talk about, is the digital gap. And the attention or emphasis of dealing with that digital gap has been on the internet access and devices. Now, between a number of factors, internet access in most of the state for the schools is no longer a problem. Between smarter balance testing and the distance learning, the devices are no longer the problem. The problem with the digital gap, which is not getting attention, is that what of the digital skills that are being universally utilized as part of instruction. And as a person who's in K-12 in the schools and sees it, what is universally used as digital school skills and instruction has not changed in 20 to 25 years as the world has continued to move on. Universally, our high school graduates are not being provided with the digital skill sets to be ready for the workforce. And for the superintendent, in conversations with staff in your department, there has been resistance and hostility to deal with emerging technology and digital tools to promote that and provide the professional development needs for the teachers to be able to utilize that in the classroom.
I'm going to take that as a question for me. I'd love to hear about the resistance that you've encountered, and we can talk about that offline. Thank you for raising that. I was thinking as you were speaking that we have opportunities on a continuum to make sure our students are prepared for the jobs of tomorrow. During the pandemic, we spoke with nonprofits that worked with parents who talked to us about the lack of digital literacy available for many of our families. Everybody was rushing to get laptops and laptops and laptops. They said, but what about making sure that our families know how to use them? We even had some folks come to us and say, how do we make sure that our school staff know how to use all the technology? So we went out and raised money to provide digital literacy training for many of our families. And just like LCFF prioritizes certain families, we also prioritize those families. You know, when you think about the impacts of the pandemic on academics, you know, you have to acknowledge that our schools went into the pandemic and 1 million of our students didn't have access to a computer or access to high-speed internet at a time when those devices were the most important ways to be connected to your school staff or a mental health provider for telehealth. And so hard to imagine that in a state with our wealth, with Silicon Valley and our resources, that this could be the case. But the digital divide came as aware to us as ever during the pandemic. And within weeks, we all mobilized, myself, Mr. Chida, the governor, the first partner, our state board president, and at a time when there were no devices even available from manufacturers, we were able to move 1 million devices to our students. We were able to secure money for our schools. It was about $5 billion that we gave to our school districts to purchase equipment. We then, through legislation that I was proud to sponsor and partner with others, like Senator Gonzalez and others, we provided about $6 billion for broadband so that those places in our state that don't even have connectivity can get connectivity. And so I think you're right that we've moved from where we were quickly to making sure that folks have devices, but we can't hotspot our way to having folks who are prepared for the jobs of tomorrow. We have to make sure our students should have had and still deserve to have things like computer science from pre-K through 12th grade. Our biggest challenge right now is being able to have enough educators who have the training to provide that. We are providing, for anyone who's interested, a $20,000 scholarship for anyone who wants to become a teacher, and we prioritize areas like computer science, bilingual education, math, science, any STEAM field. And so we're on the mission to help to create this continuum of opportunities for our students, but we've got to be able to secure educators who are trained to provide this work. And we have to make sure that our students get opportunities to hands-on opportunities like internships through CTE. There are jobs in engineering and science, but there are also jobs that someone can enter with a certificate to work in cybersecurity. How many districts and institutions have been hacked in just the last several months? There are 100,000 jobs in cybersecurity that need to be filled right now. And so what I'm saying is we have to make sure that California aligns with what our industry is telling us, where the opportunities are going, where AI is going, and every other aspect of technology. And then we have to find ways to fill teaching spots, provide professional development and training for those educators to be able to provide what is important from the standpoint of where the sector is going. And there are many partners here in higher education who are working with us. We have a brand new STEAM group of advisors, folks from industry and higher education and students and others who are helping us figure out what are the training opportunities that need to exist for students and staff. For anybody who's interested in becoming a teacher, you know somebody who's interested in becoming a teacher, tell them to give me a call, 1-800-WHERE-YOU-AT, and I got your scholarship for you. Actually, they can go to teachandca at cde.ca.gov. We've worked with Mr. Chida and others and the governor, and now we're able to offer $40,000 for someone who's in a teacher residency program. You know, all the resources are in place. No state is preparing folks with the resources like California. No state is. But we experience a major threat to our success, and that is a nationwide threat of having teachers who are ready. On Monday, we're having a teacher recruitment summit. We're launching a statewide teacher recruitment coalition. we invite you to join us at the State Board of Education at 11 a.m. or join by Zoom. Myself, our State Board President, Dr. Darlene Hammond, all of the organizations that work on teacher recruitment. This is the challenge. For the reasons that you state, to address technology, to address transitional kindergarten, to address bilingual education, math, science, and arts. We need thousands of teachers and in some cases classified staff who will be working to educate our students to prepare them for the very jobs. And so again, we invite you to spread the word about the $20,000 scholarship, and we've created a one-stop portal for anyone who wants to become an educator to be able to find out about openings, scholarships, professional development, and how they can get on the journey to become a great educator in our state.
Thank you for that comprehensive and inspiring answer. Anne has a question.
Yes, Your Honor, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. My name is Mary Ann Wormerdam. I'm with Rural County Representatives of California, so we represent 40 rural counties in the state. One of the challenges that our County Board of Supervisors tell us almost continuously is between geographic and language and disadvantaged community concerns in their counties. Getting a little more granular and building on the technical component, we fill our academic requirements for K through 12 with a fairly robust level of areas where we want folks to be conversant. What we're hearing is with the opportunities in the technical fields and the lack of immediate opportunity for higher education, whether it's a community college or a four-year institution, how do you see us weaving into the K-12 criteria the kind of technical baseline to allow our students to stay in community and still go after some of these competitive job opportunities?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great question. I think, I think we have to continue to increase funding and opportunities in the career technical education space. I think that's something I'm working with a number of my colleagues on in the legislature. We have a bipartisan bill moving forward to increase access to career technical education. It is something that, it's also about, to the previous question as well, it's also about improving access when it comes to internet. I think particularly in the rural communities, when the pandemic hit, that was especially problematic, and my district partnered with Verizon to get hotspots to everyone, but I think the superintendent's right. We can't hotspot our way out of this problem. One thing the legislature has been doing is holding the PUC accountable for rolling out broadband dollars in a technology neutral way. I think in the places of the state where broadband makes sense, we need to be able to do that. But in the more rural communities, we also need to be willing to adapt and adopt different technologies that may include fast internet, but maybe not broadband, but still be able to use some of that funding. And so getting creative about the ways that we're increasing that access in our state. But it's also, to the superintendent's point, about partnerships between community colleges. That's right. And K through 12.
That's right.
I think that's critical, and our private partners,
that's
our
right.
workforce,
That's
right?
right.
We need to have advisory groups on the ground, and I know we do in many cases, but of community college representatives, school, K through 12 representatives, and workforce partners in every region to say these are the employees that we're looking for. These are the opportunities we have available that students can make a great wage coming out of high school or coming out of certification program, and we need to all get everyone on the same page in providing those opportunities.
I think of these two questions in very similar ways, actually, and through the lens of being the cradle to career person, because in so many ways, this is the mission, this is what we have to do. So I have two thoughts on this. The first is 100%. It has to be about, and I love the way that, Superintendent, you expanded the answer to talk about skill building and workforce and all of that, because that's absolutely critical. When we're talking about LCFF, we were talking about equity, we were talking about family engagement and parental involvement. In a lot of ways, that's framed nationally as a dichotomy. It's either or, but it's actually a false choice. They could be the both and the same. And this is a great example of it, which is to say, from an equity perspective, connecting people to jobs and skills and real life careers is an equity play. That's about social mobility. That's about the American dream. and from an actual sort of just like family, what students and families want. That's also what they tell us they want. So in so many ways, this is the obvious path forward, which is actually aligning our K-12, higher ed, and workforce systems so that we're actually building these pathways in a meaningful way. And I think the second thought I had is we also have to do it in a geographic and place-conscious way, which is to say that California is not one big economy or one big workforce. We are many, many different regional economies and workforces. And so the governor has really recognized that, and we've created 13 different regions throughout the state, $600 million for the Community Economic Resilience Fund, and $250 million for the K-16 collaboratives. I think most relevant here is, people might not know, is we are going to have these tables set in each region of K-12 people, higher ed people, and the private sector and employers. And their job is to do exactly what you're talking about, which is how do we ensure that we're taking the students who are with us right now and actually putting them on a pathway towards careers where they could also stay in the community and stay within the region and help that region grow. So that's definitely the vision that we have.
Could I
please.
I also plus one everything that the assembly member said and Mr. Chida said, but to the partnership, the opportunity to have students engage in dual enrollment, there are some partners in this very room who can help. And I'm actually thinking as an example, in Fresno, one of the regional alliances that Mr. Chida references, community colleges working with our four-year institutions, both our CSU and our private and independent colleges have established a way for a student to be involved in dual enrollment programs, and then they can attend a CSU or they can attend one of the private colleges that I just happened to learn about. There is a university in Fresno that is a private college that is in partnership and does a lot around teacher recruitment. And so a student can be involved in dual enrollment programs right now in a rural community. And we do have access to some partners who are working in some of our rural communities to work through the lack of connectivity. And they have found some strategies to help. But I would just acknowledge that we have the president of California's independent and private colleges here in the room, Kristen Soros, who can help to connect you to that partnership in a rural community, using Fresno as an example.
Thank you. This is a fascinating subject because we're talking about the future, and we're talking about hope, and we're talking about our students. I wish we had more time. I do want to say that PPIC has a report coming out soon exactly on what you just mentioned, Superintendent, and that is transfers, dual enrollment with community colleges and moving thereon to CSUs and UCs. It's coming out soon. We hope you take a look at that. But we want to thank our distinguished panel, our sophisticated audience. Truly, this has been, for me and for all of us, an online audience, truly an inspirational discussion about a 10-year anniversary of a funding formula thought out on behalf of the children of California. We thank our sponsors, we thank you, we thank Ms. Pai, we thank our expert, Julien Lafortune, we thank PPIC staff for putting this together. We wish we had more time. We don't, but you can find information like this on our website. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.